So I'm gonna go ahead and start recording now. We are going to be doing a couple of reflection exercises. So I hope each of you are willing and able to be present on Google Docs for a bit of a share out. We'll be defining data trauma, talking about surveillance, capitalism, and emotional contagion, and as well as getting into the core of the meat of this session, which is about divestment and reparations, as well as harm reduction. So the film that we're gonna start out by viewing is one, hold on, let me see, it's not letting me click. Oops. Here we go. So we're gonna start by watching the first 6 or 7 minutes of this film. Let me know if the audio is.
Light on face, so everybody shine so. Jumbo na jumbo, tokota na pisto. Tobe taba selfie, bayonke ba mommy. People that's normal, everyone get his spotlight. Tobe taba selfie, bayonke ba mommy. People that's normal, everyone get his spotlight. Oh.
Is that advertising?
Have you a charger?
Everybody is trying to sell. Jumbo na jumbo, tokota na pizza. Everyone get this spotlight. Dans le visage du clignote. Spotlight. Tu ne lances pas notre pianote. Spotlight. Miroir, pixelisé. Le plein est vitalisé. Drive duplicated. Mirage oméga en paix. Light on the place, everybody is trying to sell. Jumbo na jumbo, tokota na pizza. Then I'm a selfie. I am never mommy. Everyone get this spotlight. Souvenir, screenshot, le monde nous téléporte. Baby, easy jet setter, est ici et ailleurs. On se tourne les pouces pour s'échapper en douce. Pour toutes les bourses, tous les égaux, l'enfant aux intérêts gauches. Light on the place, everybody is trying to sell.
I'm actually gonna fast forward a tiny bit to the second part of the clip. Okay.
Mamu kondi kakati. Wepi kina basuki no otoko kaptata RTNC.
Ah, tanti. Ah, suki nengeza difficilité.
Nazo mona. Bino bana ki, poli kotika suki zo mpepete. Kocha la perruque. Suki mabe salité bout.
Je te dis la perruque pour les aides locales.
Oh.
Tu veux comment bakabilo?
Si. Même si tu es bana mikolo boli ngaba samboka. Même ba Serena William wana. Yo kati baza ba meshte.
Tanti, mon photo la Facebook. 3000 j'aime. Na mitema likolo.
Zombie. Lego. Tu dors debout, c'est tu parles flou, oh, c'est la maladie du sommeil. Les frères sont en mode veille. Comment voir plus loin que le bout de son joint? Bourdon, d'humeur bourdon. Le poisson c'est du bégon. La tête dans le guidon, cacheton, soporifique, moustique, attrape, clic, 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 sur les nuisibles, insectes, rampants, invisibles. Grossi, 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 grossi. Ozoni maya kotelema lokola liboke ya bazomie. Moustiquaire, antipop, antiseptique ou antidote. Zombie, au pied ni clé.
Yes,
Juste
Beloji.
Est-ce qu'on a...
Okay. So I wanted to start out with that clip because, of course, today's session is under the Afro-Presentism track here at Allied Media Conference. And what this track is trying to do is situate Black diasporic culture in the digital realm and unpack the ways in which we're dealing with the complexities and challenges and honestly the traumas of being enmeshed in the digital world. And looking specifically at the continent and looking, I mean, also the diaspora as well, but I like this piece because, is the screen frozen for y'all as well? Yeah, okay, let's see. I'm gonna restart the screen share. Thank you so much for your patience, everyone. It is very, very difficult to try and navigate all of these digital pieces, so the patience is much appreciated. Give me just 1 second. In the meanwhile, feel free to share in the chat anything that stuck out to you from that video. Just another second, it's loading. It's funny, there's always glitches. Hmm. So sorry about this, y'all. My computer has completely frozen. 1 second. Okay. Yeah, it's not the video, it's actually the presentation that's frozen. So just give me 1 minute. I'm trying it on a different browser and seeing whether that'll help. I really appreciate the grace that all of you are extending right now. I feel at ease in this group. So, okay, cool. So I've got it out. Awesome. Yay, got it. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So as I was saying, I like to start off with that video because as we're talking about Afro-presentism and Black cultural production, it takes so many forms, music being a large part of it, the moving image, and conversation is also a pinnacle of like Black intellectual exchange. So when we talk about guerrilla theory, this is a framework I've been practicing within for the past couple of years that upholds conversation as the highest vote of speculation. So that includes our conversation on Zoom here today, it's conversations in the kitchen, in the garden, on your block. It's thinking about the ways in which we intellectualize everyday moments without being really elitist and exclusionary in that. So today's presentation and session and exchange is a proclamation not of expertise, but of curiosity. And I really welcome all of you to bring your reflections. In a world where power is brokered through formal education, and emergent spaces like Allied Media and other collectives are beacons of guerrilla theorizing. So I'm really excited to share in that space with y'all today and wanted to kick us off with a kind of guerrilla theory exercise asking about how Instagram and the algorithms spill over into your real life. So I'm gonna go ahead and share the link to this Google Doc and invite y'all to add your responses. So we're looking at 4 main areas: social and interpersonal impacts. So for example, the ways in which Instagram encourages us to judge people based off of their like and follow accounts. We're looking at political impacts. So for example, the trend, especially since 2020, to reduce movements to aesthetics. There are a range of psychological impacts, the feelings of invisibility that come up in virtual space. And there are also spiritual components to the toxicity that Instagram really cultivates in our world. And so I'm curious to hear your own experiences and reflections with Instagram. I said this session is for the girlies who are always trying to delete and deactivate the platform, but keep coming back. And I think the tensions that we experience with Instagram are more often than not collective tensions, and there aren't enough spaces really to be able to unpack that and share that. So I'm hoping that this doc can be a starting point. Let me share the link. All right. Just in case. So we'll just take a couple of minutes and get into that doc. Hmm. So interesting. Less vigilance and thinking about who is authoring information on being shared. Absolutely. Creation of parasocial relationships. Judging my own sense of productivity, art value in comparison to others. Story like checking, yes. Feeling like I'm wasting time, that I could be doing something more meaningful, absolutely. These psychological ones are really hitting home. I'm seeing a lot of people adding in that category. Wow. It's interesting because I think a lot of us flock to social media for a feeling of connectivity. And what I'm seeing in each of these responses is a profound sense of distance, be it from your own well-being or from the relationships that actually matter to you. There's also a handful of comments about like aestheticization. I saw someone write under the spiritual column, the aesthetics of spiritual, where did it go? Let me see. Someone said, the aesthetics of spirituality over spirit work. Absolutely. Way less alone time with my own thoughts. I think another interesting thing is each of these categories are in relationship to one another, right? It's kind of hard to even delineate which impact is hitting which area, because I say the psychological and the spiritual are in close relationship, but oftentimes we're made to think that our relationships to social media are very surface level, right? People are like, oh, but it's just Instagram. And it can be very gaslighting to the depth of experience that we actually like are confronted with within these spaces. I'll give us another minute or two to add into this. Less time daydreaming and being as innovative as I was as a child. Interesting. I also welcome people to come off of mute and speak out loud if they would prefer that to typing. I know sometimes Google Docs can be overwhelming. Mistaking social media posting as political action. Hoping that what you care about can make sense and be digestible for others. Connections rooted in transaction over care. Wow. Oh, I see some of you skipping ahead to the second activity, the reparations question. Wait till the end, we'll get there, we'll get there. So a lot of the things that you are all sharing could easily be identified as data trauma. And before we get into that, there's this quote that I find really resonates with a lot of what you were sharing as well. It says, technology has solved old economic problems by giving us new psychological problems. The internet has not just open sourced information, it has also open sourced insecurity, self-doubt, and shame. And this is from Mark Manson's book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, which I highly recommend you all check out. I began theorizing around the internet and researching the internet in 2016 with a project entitled #DigitalDiaspora, which was looking at the ways in which Afro-diasporic creatives were articulating new identities online. And at the time, I was very optimistic about the possibility of Instagram being a place where cultural renaissance could be tended to and cultivated. But This was also around the time that the Instagram like feed changed from being chronological to algorithmic, and surveillance capitalism became a way bigger part of our digital landscape, specifically on Facebook and its associated platforms. And in 2019, I attended a class by a brilliant technologist by the name of Olivia M. Ross as part of Bufu's Wi-Fi summer school program, which is a really incredible guerrilla education program that took place here in New York City in 2019. And at the time, I had deactivated my Instagram. I was like very, very techno pessimist. My response to the kind of tensions I was feeling around surveillance capitalism was to just like make it all disappear and leave. And in this class, Olivia said, and I quote, "Data trauma is a real thing." And that was the first time I'd ever heard those two words be put together, data and trauma. We talk a lot about trauma in the physical world, but at that time, I didn't realize that like the experiences that I was having, the feeling of wanting to disappear, which in the class was referred to as a digital social death, was actually a manifestation of trauma. And so I started reflecting more about what data trauma meant and referred to. And it's essentially like, if you think about the digital realm and you think about the physical realm, the traumas that we experience in each of them are very much so reflections of one another. However, due to algorithmic bias and influence in the digital realm, these traumas tend to be amplified. So some examples of data trauma are surveillance capitalism, which I'll define in the next slide, algorithmic bias, which I'm sure many of us here have experienced. There's a trend where people who are sharing more politically outspoken content that isn't also aesthetically pleasing are deprioritized in the algorithm. There's the feeling of scrolling down your feed and seeing selfies right next to images of people being harmed and murdered and extremely graphic videos, and the numbing that that linearity imposes upon us. And then there's also being censored and deplatformed. And this is something that happens most often to sex workers and other people who have different relationships with their bodies. And it's actually a very, very sinister form of violence to be censored or deplatformed that is also often gaslit, because for many people, these platforms are their sources of income, are their connections to community, and also have this relationship to personhood. And, you know, as we think about data trauma and as we go throughout the session, I want to encourage y'all to disavow shame. There's so much shame that is involved with our digital relationships, be it being ashamed for how connected we are to them or being ashamed to our addiction to them. Another example of data trauma is being doxxed. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, being doxxed is when private information about you, for example, where you live or work, is shared online without your consent. And this is a form of data trauma that puts people's bodies in physical harm. So to define surveillance capitalism for folks who might not be familiar, this is a term that has been theorized extensively by Shoshana Zuboff in her book by the same name. And she says, "I define surveillance capitalism as the unilateral claiming of private human experience as free material for translation into behavioral data. These data are then computed and packaged as prediction products and sold into behavioral futures markets. Business customers with a commercial interest in knowing what we will do now, soon, and later." So if you think back to the slide that you all are filling into those four categories, social, interpersonal, psychological, spiritual, and cultural, each of those categories are being digested as data and being bought and sold to highest bidders. So if you take Facebook, for example, I guess Meta now, this is a $70-billion company that makes over 80% of its revenue through advertising, which is really the exchange of this commerce. And this is why people, you know, there's this common saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, which can be a bit reductive, but also is a bit of an accessible introduction for people who might just now be getting into understanding surveillance capitalism. And within this same thread, there's another theorist by the name of Jaron Lanier, who is one of the founding fathers of virtual reality. And he calls social media, not social media, but behavioral modification empires. So what these platforms are doing is taking everything that you do on them and categorizing it, right? So here are two screenshots. One is of my Instagram data that I downloaded, and I encourage all of you to do the same, just to get a sense of the kind of information that is being accumulated about you. And I think it's interesting because there's a lot of data that actually is not included here that they do aggregate. For example, location demographics, the number of times that you're looking at a post, like with eye tracking, and a whole lot of other sinister things that we don't need to get into. But this is the material that is being bought and sold, right? And they condense this material into profiles that determine the kinds of advertising that you might be interested in. So on the right is a screenshot of some of the interests that Facebook has determined that I'm drawn to. And I actually, some of these things I haven't even heard of, right? So I was really curious, like, where did this come from? How do they claim to know this about me? I'm like, okay, Remy Ma, that checks out. Dance, yeah. Sotheby's, I don't care about them folk, I'm sorry. Autotrader.com, no idea. I don't even have my driver's license. Dries Van Noten, never heard of them a day in my life. And so looking at this data and trying to reverse engineer it, I'm like, what could be feeding this? Is it what people are saying around me? Is it what I'm looking at? And it's that kind of opacity, the lack of insight into what is actually being accumulated about us, that creates this landscape of invasiveness and a lack of consent within these platforms. And it gets a little more sinister than that. So in 2014, Facebook actually conducted a study on what they call emotional contagion in social networks, in which they were testing their ability to manipulate the emotion of their users by changing the tone of the posts that would appear in their feeds. So they did this to almost 700,000 people over the course of the experiment without getting the consent or knowledge of their research subjects. And this is the kind of data that is feeding this $70-billion company, in which we all show up as laborers, for lack of a better term, right? And so in this session, when we're thinking about divest from Instagram, the urgency comes from this. These platforms, yes, they connect us. Yes, they give us outlets. And also there's a level of emotional, spiritual, psychological manipulation that is taking place on these platforms that is urgent to push back against. And so I'm hopeful that over the course of the day, we can begin to think about demands that can be made, starting off with identifying the places in which we've been harmed by these platforms and their adjacents, and moving towards thinking and dreaming of more liberatory futures and relationships on there. There's this really interesting quote that has been, a concept that's been circulating for the past couple of years, that says data is the new oil. And this parallel is very central to this discussion of divestment. The term divestment comes from largely from climate justice movements. And oil is a commodity that the earth has really been pilfered from, that quite literally powers much of our electrical landscape, right? But Geert Lovink writes about this in a way that kind of illuminates a bit of liberatory potential. He says, recently we're witnessing the rise of peak data. Like peak oil, this is the theoretical point when the maximum rate of data extraction has been attained. Peak data is the moment when the internet giants already know everything about you. The moment when additional details begin to tip the balance and cause their data regime to slowly but inexorably implode. This is the turning point. The data phantom of the self begins to crumble. The system produces such amounts of data that either everyone will become a suspect or no one. So although it's incredibly daunting to think about the sheer breadth of data that is being collected about us, it's actually a very interesting place that we find ourselves in here in 2022, because these platforms are beginning to have so much data that the data itself is becoming less valuable and nearly obsolete, right? And within this data saturated environment, there is room for anonymity, but there must be strategy to move towards this anonymity, right? When this data phantom of the self begins to crumble, what do we do next? And how do we gather to kind of encourage this implosion? And another interesting point with this idea of peak oil is, I'm sure some of you have noticed, on Google or Instagram, this idea of screen time. seemingly, trying to get us to limit the time that we spend on these devices under the guise of it being for our wellness, when in reality, these screen time measuring endeavors are actually in the pursuit of limiting the amount of data that we feed to this platform, so that the time that we do spend on the platform is able to garner better insights, right? So as we're thinking about strategy, it's actually, there's a whole range of things that we can be doing to push back. You can actually just like go to a bunch of pages that don't interest you at all and throw off the data regime by like trolling it, right? Maybe I was on autotrader.com, great, like that is not my personality. I don't want these giants to try and have a sense of who I am. And so I'm really interested in like unpacking this idea of what it looks like for both everyone and no one to become a suspect. Which leads me to the core question of today's session. What would happen if all Black queer content creators left Instagram? And I actually don't really like the term content creators, because I think we're so much more than that. We're people, we're spirits, we're like multi-expansive beings. But for the sake of thinking about Instagram, that is what we end up being reduced to, right? We're expected to translate our lives and our cultures into content, which in the English language is a synonym, right, for joy, contentment. My dear friend Yoon put me onto that parallel, and it was very illuminating for me. So as we like ruminate on this question, I encourage y'all to like hop in the chat and send in your feedback, but we'll also get a moment to do so in the doc. So as I was saying, the phrase divest from Instagram, this term divestment emerges largely from the climate justice movement, thinking about divesting from fossil fuels. And divestment is a powerful strategy because it's the opposite of investment. And it's a spectral strategy. There are a number of ways to divest. Personally, within my own practice, in 2019, I thought that I would do like a holistic divestment and leave the platform entirely, but that didn't end up being sustainable because I still needed to find jobs. And I think a lot of other Black queer people find themselves in that same predicament. But something that has helped me is the idea of seasonal investment, right? Because we're not talking about fossil fuels, we're talking about social media use here. It is possible for you to think about like, okay, so for these months, I will be on the platform, and for these months, I will be off the platform. And Jared Lanier, who I mentioned earlier in the presentation, actually suggests that everybody takes at minimum a 6-month break from social media at some point in their lives. I'm also really curious to hear like whether any of y'all in this session have taken large swaths of time off of Instagram. Maybe you can share in the chats like the longest amount of time that you've been away from the platform. At the end of the session, I'll share a little guide, a resource guide for people who are interested in taking a social media detox with journaling prompts and all of that. But we'll get there. This exodus and this like kind of campaign is something that started in 2019 with Reflect to Revolutionize sessions that I was running with a collective I was a part of called Radical Love Consciousness. And it was really a response to the forms of data trauma that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So thinking about the ways that algorithmic bias was working within my own relationship to the internet. I noticed that when I would post things that had the words like revolution or capitalism or Black power in the captions, those posts would not be shown to as many people. And even in the promotion of this event, you know, I wrote something about like, I think it was a separate post, but sometimes like if you're only sharing like educational information, your post can be shown to less than 1% of your following. And there's no transparency as to how this is happening, which is what necessitates this kind of guerrilla speculation and noticings exchange, and which forms the building block of this aspirational exodus. This idea of Black queer people exiting a platform is one that in recent years has actually gained a bit of precedence. So I'm not sure if y'all are familiar, but in last fall, and I believe it was September, a group of Black TikTok dance creators decided to go on strike and to stop creating dances And this was a response to their frustrations at not being credited and not being compensated for their contributions, not only to the platforms, but to the artists whose work that they were promoting. So I'm going to play the first couple of minutes of this video. Hope, fingers crossed, that my computer doesn't glitch out again, but if it does, do a little dance, shimmy a little bit while we get it back up. But yeah, okay, so this, as you're watching this, think about how this sets precedent and what it would look like if Black queer people.
Black TikTok creators are not feeling the love, so they're striking.
There are the viral dances.
Everybody is just kind of scratching their heads, looking and watching these train wrecks.
But at the time, no one was crediting the dance's creator, Jalea Harmon, then just 14 years old.
Hi, Black TikTok is on strike. Welcome. Hey, I'm Taylor Cassidy. TikTok is on strike, and by that I mean the choreographers and Black creators that have been carrying this app on their back since the beginning are refusing to give a dance to Megan Thee Stallion's new poppin' song Thought Girls Fit for another white creator to steal. How do we know they're on strike? Because white people do not know what to do when a Black creator doesn't give them a trend to copy it off of. Evidence. What are they doing? Black creators are sick of creating these bomb dances that take time, energy, and intellect to create just to have another creator not give them credit for it, but also reap the success, the brand deals, the exposure from it. And then they're like tucked away like, oh, if I at you in my caption, then that's enough. It's not enough anymore. Now, this phenomenon has been going on for a while and it is not new, surprise, surprise. So if you're somehow still confused as to why Black people need the same amount of success and benefits that come to these white creators, why are you still confused? Because I can't help you at this point, but I'm still going to give you history anyway.
All right. So, okay, 1 sec. Let's give it a little freeze again. Give it a little freeze again. I really love that clip because as somebody who wasn't on TikTok until recently, when my dear friend, comrade, collaborator, Sige Tafese, introduced me to the most healing corner of Black auntie TikTok, I was really like out of the loop of what was happening there. And I think I wrote it off as just like being this like kiddie app where people are just like playing around. But it's really inspiring to see that Black Gen Z youth were realizing that their cultural contributions on social media were a form of labor, and that there would be and to take that a step further in creating the solidarity of joining forces, right? And like halting their virality power to make a statement. And I think part of why this didn't get the traction and acknowledgement that it was deserving of is because of this cultural tendency to write off social media as this thing that the kids are doing, and like as this like just kind of playful afterthought. But to think about us as a labor force on social media, I think is a pretty groundbreaking realization. You know, we're seeing so many brands and corporations take Black language and do corporate blackface because of viral trends that they're seeing on the internet. And I'm really interested in this idea of virality and how it can be hacked, this kind of fascination with scale and speed, and how as a collective, as like Black queer people, we can place a little like, what is it called? You know, when a wheel is moving and you put a piece of wood and it stops everything, like it's really giving world stop, carry on if we decide. But to continue on with examples of precedents for strikes, digital strikes, and divestment in that particular way. Last year, there was a group that came out called the Facebook Logout, and it was a coalition of organizations that had come together to demand that people, or to invite people to demand changes from Facebook. And here's their website. I'm gonna actually just like do a quick run over it. So it's by Kairos, and they're saying, we are really over Facebook, so we've logged out. From allowing white supremacists to plan a violent insurrection to ignoring disinformation for profit, Facebook is doing their worst. So we did the thing that will get Facebook's attention, organized the logout. In a historic feat, 40 diverse organizations came together in the fight to hold Facebook accountable. And they were able to get 55,000 people to sign up and do it. And again, as somebody who is within this like ecosphere, it somehow, I didn't hear about this until much after. And I wonder the role that the algorithmic silencing plays within that, right? Because so many of us do turn to Facebook and Instagram to figure out what's on, what's popping. And so if Facebook is identifying the posts that are talking against its favor and intentionally silencing those, what does it look like to organize around this kind of logout, around this kind of general strike? And what was interesting to me was they had this list of issues and demands. Their main asks were to get new leadership and have Mark Zuckerberg step down as CEO, to prioritize data privacy, and to build systems so that engagement doesn't have like disinformation, et cetera. And to stop, I hope they actually did stop this, but they were pushing for an Instagram for kids, which would be for like young children to have a social media platform, which it's giving child mind control to be stopped. And this platform was also talking about tackling disinformation and misinformation, transparency on content moderation, which speaks to the data trauma we were speaking earlier about deplatforming and censorship. But what they were not touching on, what this campaign did not touch on, was reparations. So they say here that in 2020, Facebook made 98% of its revenue from advertising. And this is how they keep us on the platform. This is why they're generating insights and tracking us and everything. But that revenue is over $100 billion. I think it was at around $150 billion. I am of the belief that it is urgent that we demand a redistribution of that money, and begin to dream of ways to have programs, like dreaming as if the money is already redistributed. So the next part of this session is going to be another little Google Docs exercise off of this following question. If Facebook released a $50 billion reparations fund and you were in charge of allocating that spending towards restorative programs, what would you fund? And I encourage you to write this as if the fund is already in place. And it's in that same Google Doc from earlier. So if you still have access to that, maybe someone can resend it in the link. Let me check out what the chat's saying. Yes, affordable, safe, luxurious, community-centered, trauma healing, focus-free housing. Another one for that one, speak on it. That's incredible. I love that it's like housing, because I think also, this feeling of communion that we're all in pursuit of is what draws us to these platforms in the ways that we do. And I'm like, if we had real community opportunities offline, real public space that allowed us to like access the conversations and kind of stimuli that we long for, we would not be spending these like hours and hours at a time scrolling. I get so embarrassed when I see my little report of how much time I spent on the platform, because even when I think like, oh, like I'm looking out for new projects and figuring out, what people I love are up to, I'm like, is there a reason for me to be spending 5 hours a day on days where I'm not working doing that? And like, I'm not getting compensated for that. Maybe I'm hustling, and creatively, but there is this deep, deep need for physical space. Wow, goodness. Yes, social media free mental health refuges, funded with generous funds for childcare, cost of living, spas, and trained healers who are on staff with generous benefits, salaries, and space. I know that's right. Large sustained grants for spiritual workers. Land back. Okay, speak on that actually. Something I didn't necessarily get to touch on because it's more general to digital landscapes than Instagram, but is like the level of environmental damage that our use of this platform cultivates, and like our cell phone dependency, thinking about like the child labor that goes into mining the minerals that are a part of our phone, thinking about like coltan, I think columbite tantalite, I don't want to missay it, but coltan being a key ingredient in our phone that is mined like across largely like Africa and Asia, and the conditions that are involved in that. So the land is in deep relationship to each of these. Yes, Cash App, all niggas. I love that. Yep, we farming. Yes. Agroecological support for small scale BIPOC farmers. Absolutely. Bail out all our folks. Yes. Money to disabled users. Yes. One thing I will say is, like, even as I was speaking about feeling moments of shame about how much time I spend online, as somebody who is neurodivergent, like, and for whom like just being out and about in the physical world is a lot, it is actually a space of respite to be able to be on my phone and have that connectivity. But it's especially sinister for that reason, right? Thinking about the ways that disabled and like neurodivergent people end up relying on these platforms and how these platforms are aware of that and continue to extract and monetize and yeah, capitalize off of that relationship and I don't want to call it dependency. And I can't call it symbiosis because it's not symbiotic, but whatever that kind of attachment and use is. So that is a question. This idea of data reparations is one I've been musing on since, like, you know, beginning to organize and congregate around data healing and data trauma. And this past fall, I wrote this speculative nonfiction piece entitled The Data Healing Recovery Clinic. And I call it speculative nonfiction because I have faith that it will come true, because I have faith that with proper organizing, this reparations fund from Meta Incorporated is a reality that we will see in our lifetime. And so this piece takes the form of an FAQ page for a recovery clinic, a therapy center that is part of a large, well-funded network across the globe for people to gather and heal from their social media-induced distress. And so the three core questions around this therapeutic practice are: how have Facebook and Instagram brought harm into your life? How have you harmed others in response? And what steps can we take together to resolve this harm and rewire our algorithmically programmed behaviors? And so thinking about this care space where you're not only invited to do some reflection, but you're also funded to create projects that help you like heal the same trauma that is bringing you to this space, right? So imagining a multi-billion-dollar grant where people can talk, process, but also rebuild. Because when we talk about divestment, right, when you divest, when you remove your investment from something, that allocates more space and resource to invest in something else. So we're thinking about our spiritual contributions and investments. We're thinking about our time investments. We're thinking about our attention investments, and thinking about all of these like various currency in which reparations could support us. Is there any? I feel like I've been also talking for a while, so if there's anyone who feels called to come off mute and share, I welcome that. Yeah, sharing together. Sabbatical funds for sex workers. I really, really love that. Wow. This is really special, y'all. I'm gonna just take another moment to read through this and give y'all a chance to read through it as well. All right. So there's around 30 minutes left. Okay. So while we wrap up in that document, let's get to the last segment here, which is about harm reduction. So as I was saying earlier, you know, as we're working out, just a second, another patient moment. Okay, great. So as I was saying earlier, like, as we begin to think about divestment, it's really important to alleviate ourselves from shame, because social media truly is an addiction. It has been shown that our dopamine receptors respond to like counts. There are studies that have also talked about how these social media platforms will strategically withhold likes. So you'll post an image and they will withhold giving you notifications about who's liked it so that you can continue to go back and check and refresh. And so there are all of these like tiny ways, tiny sinister ways that our addiction is programmed on these platforms. But if it is an addiction, if that's how we're speaking about it, it must be approached with harm reduction strategies. There are a wide range of examples of what harm reduction is and looks like. So I'm just sharing this as context. There's sunscreen, you know, if you're gonna be out in the sun, use some sunscreen. Cigarette filters, people are smoking. It's like thinking about something that is toxic, and harm reduction is a way to accept that people are still going to participate in an activity that might be dangerous or harmful, but that there are ways to mitigate the level of harm that is experienced there. I'm going to share a couple of slides from the harm reduction platform to further contextualize it. So harm reduction is a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing negative consequences associated with drug use, or in this case, social media use. It incorporates a spectrum of strategies that include safer use, managed use, abstinence, meeting people who use where they're at. And that's a key part. If you are on Instagram 11 hours a day, if you haven't used your Instagram in 2 years, wherever you're at on the spectrum, these principles meet you there, right? And addressing the conditions of use along with the use itself. Because harm reduction demands that interventions and policies designed to serve people who use social media reflect specific individual and community needs, there is no universal definition of or formula for implementing harm reduction. And if we had more time, I would do another kind of Google Doc exercise to think about what digital harm reduction exercises could look like for each of you. But for now, I'll just share more about this idea of harm reduction so that you can begin to reflect about what it would look like within your own life. So harm reduction, these are 5 of the 6 pinnacles. It understands social media use. We're going to replace drug use with social media use for this context. Understand social media use as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon that encompasses a continuum of behaviors from severe use to total abstinence, and acknowledges that some ways of being on these platforms are clearly safer than others. It calls for non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services and resources to people who use drugs and the community in which they live in to assist them in reducing attendant harm. Harm reduction accepts, for better or worse, that licit and illicit social media use is part of our world and chooses to work to minimize its harmful effects rather than simply ignore or condemn them. So this point makes me think about this kind of minimization of social media and like this kind of, again, the gaslighting we were speaking about earlier that reduces its level of like importance in people's lives and that negates kind of the level of harm that we do experience there. Harm reduction also establishes the quality of individual and community life and well-being, not necessarily the cessation of all social media use as the criteria for successful interventions and policies. So this makes me think of some of those points that you all put up in the reparations from Facebook posts, thinking about safe housing and like these kind of interventions and alternatives that would be focused more on the well-being of folks rather than the scale of their social media use. So as you begin to think about your own divestment plans, I encourage you to use that as the metric, this idea of well-being, rather than measuring, be that by hour or by days at a time, although that too can be a component of your divestment strategy. It also ensures that people who use social media and with those who have a history of social media use routinely have a real voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. And so in terms of asking for demands from Facebook, I'm curious what it would look like to have like a board of people who are advocating for a wide range of communities. And I guess like this is what people assume is happening when these companies hire like BIPOC or queer folk as this kind of representational politic. But I think finding a way to have people who have varying relationships to social media addiction in the creation of new platforms and micro communities is really essential. And like in relationship to all of these points, I think about this one a lot. The idea that abstaining from social media use entirely is not always the most accessible solution for marginalized people who rely on these platforms for community and resources. So as we're thinking about harm reduction, I ask that you give yourselves grace if you find yourself being pulled back to this platform time and time again out of a need to like gain opportunities or connect to people and yeah, be in community with like-spirited people. And I think this is specifically, you know, for people who might not live in a huge city like New York, or who might be outside of the US and who are looking for Black queer, like Black pan-Indigenous community, where Instagram seems like the most readily available option, right? But harm reduction recognizes that these realities of poverty, class, racism, social isolation, past trauma, gender-based discrimination, and other social inequalities affect both people's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with social media-related harm. And this is something I've been thinking about lately with like rave culture as well. Like I have a lot of friends who work in nightlife and, you know, who might be very, very online. And it's like, I think that it's tempting to judge people for their relationships to social media, which is really counterintuitive to this idea of harm reduction, which is rooted in compassion and grace, because, you know, if you're looking to establish yourself in a particular like, you know, social or like cultural career, a lot of times you will be asked to post, like that is part of your contract, right? That in order to get this job, you have to post on this platform. So I'm also curious to hear from people in the audience, like what kinds of like interventions and solutions that you've had around demands like that, and how that comes up within your own careers. I also want to make sure we leave a bit of time for people to like share out. So I'm going to try and breeze through the next couple of slides. And because we started around 11:30 or 11:25, we're going to have maybe another 20 to 30 minutes of this session. So just checking in with everyone about time. Let me do a quick peek into the chat and see it's fun. Yes, Neptune Frost. Highly, highly recommend everyone check that out. Absolutely, this feeling of anxiety of being away from social media too long. Yeah, how would you find things like AMC in the space if we weren't on social media? I've had to rely on Instagram a lot to send out the link for this, you know, for this session, because we have this fantasy of decentralization, but it actually makes it very difficult to access the kinds of conversations and events that you might want to, which is why, you know, when I started doing Divest from Instagram sessions in 2019, I was like really trying to preach this like total abstinence route of like, let's all just like leave forever right now. But I realized that that's just not practical. Like everything, there must be transitional modes and strategies that we engage with when we're dealing with behemoths like this that have so effectively monopolized our relationships, and like become these meeting points online. Trivialization, that's what I was looking for, the trivialization of social media. Yeah, it's interesting because it's also very easy to be deeply demoralized by these platforms. Like when I was sharing the flyers for the AMC events, like I was getting frustrated because they were being showed to like maybe like 500 people, right? And this is a project that we've been working on for a long time. And like, I was like, okay, so how are people going to find out about this? And I'd sent it out in a newsletter as well, but the same kind of fantasy of scale and connectivity that we're sold on this platform is a facade. It's that little token that they dangle at you so that you keep trying to run towards this mirage in the desert, because it's really a desert, right? And I mean, that analogy ties back to this whole relationship to the land, thinking about like, how do we restore water? How do we like water our environments online? And I'd love to hear about how folks are engaging with that as well. When I'd asked, ironically, on social media for to see what people were thinking harm reduction could look like, I got like really, really beautiful responses that I wanted to share with y'all. Someone said, internet users better understanding the value of their digital existence. Data is labor. So that's something we see come up in the TikTok strike. It's something we saw in the zombies video as well. And it'd be like incredible to be able to craft a demand where we're able to see how much your data sells for. I've always wondered, how much is my data being sold for? And why can I not access that information? And so I'd actually love to send a document afterwards for people to write more explicit demands. But anyway, another person said, digital media literacy that explores effects on health in schools. That would be an incredible program for the reparations fund to contribute towards. There's psychoeducation for people to build self-awareness and coping skills about the harms of social media. And again, we really have to divest from this trivialization of Instagram in particular, because that trivialization is what is impeding it from being taken seriously from a young age, giving people the toolkits to negotiate the severity of their relationship in the digital realm and to prepare them for the kinds of things that might emerge within these spaces. But then again, much of this digital landscape that we inhabit was not created with compassion in mind. It was created with commerce in mind. And I'm really optimistic that in the coming years, we can be able to see different digital landscapes that might not even exist on devices, right? Logging onto alternative internets. And that's a separate thread for another conversation, but really being able to dream beyond the platform as a divestment strategy within itself. There's also an interesting push. I mean, I feel types of ways about Congress and all of these formal legal institutions in America, but last year there was a testimony. Frances Haugen testified in front of Congress about the level of damage that Facebook was causing, specifically for children and democracy. And it was the first time that Facebook was publicly identified as being morally bankrupt. So as we're thinking about divesting from Instagram, it's really a grassroots response, right, to this moral bankruptcy. What role can our everyday choices play in pushing Facebook and Meta to confront this moral bankruptcy and to healing the harm that it's caused within our own lives? And I think we'll end up closing out with some divestment strategies and data demands, but I wanted to share this slide by Van Newman, who's also in the room. And this is a little blueprint about taking a social media break that Van shared in their newsletter, I believe at the beginning of last year. And I can also send it in a resource guide afterwards. Thank you so much for compiling this wonderful resource. I loved some of the recommendations that were on here. So as you're preparing to take a social media break, taking inventory of all of the things and people you think you'll miss out on. Because a lot of times you feel a little heartbroken that you'll miss things, right? So doing a manual inventory of that and checking for ways that you can keep in touch with those people or spending particular time visiting their pages. Though I will say that in terms of the data anarchism of being kind of everywhere to contribute to the peak data environment, sometimes it's a little too exposing to spend very focused time on particular pages because it does smarten the advertising engine. But if you're less concerned with that and more interested in just taking a first step to transitioning off, it's a very, very accessible way to do so. Arena is another really great platform that allows you to compile all kinds of resources. You can add documents, text files, links, etc. And it's essentially a thought bookmarking platform. It's like Pinterest, but for nerds. For nerds and graphic designers. It started out as a platform for graphic designers, but it's been a very, very useful resource to me as I've been on my own divestment journey, because another question that a lot of people ask is okay, so I leave Instagram and where do I go? And maybe y'all can share in the chat as well if you have other spaces that have been conducive to you taking time off of there. But Arena has satiated my desire to like explore niche interests and to compile like my curiosities in a place that is free of like algorithmic interference. The screenshot here is from the Divest from Instagram Arena channel, which we'll send the link to in the chat for everyone to access afterwards. But there's a whole range of resources in that channel for folks who are interested in reading more and looking for alternatives and giving more language to this experience, this longing that informs the need to divest. So I'd love to stay connected, but actually I'm going to leave it on this slide. And would you prefer for me to keep the slide up or to close it when we get in, as we get into like a bit of a share out situation? Thoughts.
I like the slide up.
Okay. Yeah, how are we feeling? What has come up in the session? Who will be brave to share? I think there was a question. I'll scroll back to the digital harm reduction question. What would digital harm reduction look like to you, and what demands could be tied to that for anyone who's brave enough to speak out loud?
Hi,
Oh,
my name is Hugh. I wanted to share what digital harm reduction looks like to me. And at this moment, your talk came at a really good time. So thank you. And I think for me, it is taking breaks, but not fully disappearing from the internet because I consider it a portal. So maybe not engaging as much, not looking as much. Yeah, and recognizing the shame I used to hold with the addiction that I have with social media and the internet. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
yeah, I just wanted to follow up just in regards to like just what Hugh just mentioned, even like just giving myself grace for the dynamic the dynamic relationship that I have, or lack of relationship that I have with social media, and also vocalizing that to people around me who often in the same way, right, Hugh, how you mentioned it's a portal. People are often like checking for me and like, oh, you're disappearing, and I'm like, yo, I'm still a person, you can call me, you know what I mean? And so really vocalizing to folks like my need to have connections off of the social media platform. So that way, yeah. Yeah.
That definitely resonates. Go ahead, Carrie.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me turn my camera on. I'm on my phone, so unprofessional. But you know, I'm so grateful that you're having this conversation, Emma. First off, I think we need to be having these conversations, and I extend grace to you because it's not easy to have these conversations when, like, most of us are very addicted to social media. And so that creates a relationship where, like, when you're addicted to something, you get defensive. So it's hard to listen to, like, you have a relationship with it. It's like a person. So a substance, you know, so then your dynamic changes. And I work in data, so it's hard to talk to people of like being intentional with the data. Like, how can I be intentional if it's you telling me to go down on my dosage, and then that's a whole other conversation. But in the comments, I mentioned how I take breaks, and now like my relationship with data is very different, and with social media, because before it was just like I wanted to disappear, and like the first person that shared said, like that's like a trauma response, you know, it's like, okay, I hate it, bye. You know, that's also an issue. But you know, I now is different, and I don't know, I'm more mindful about it, but I had to disappear. Like sometimes that's what it takes for you to find a way to gather with people and to say, okay, like, you know, you watching my story is not equivalent to you checking up on me.
Absolutely.
And if I am not on social media and like you're checking in, like, are you really checking in, or are you just liking some pictures and dropping a comment? You know, so disappearing is also necessary when reappearing and being intentional and coming to you know, to being graceful. That's a part of the process. And you see like who your real friends are, and how you're using this data, you know, more mindfully. So yeah, like I had to disappear for months and not use it, like for almost years, a year, you know, just not, like I had to hate it to be mindful with it too, to come back. And now I use it like every other day for sure. But it's more mindful. I can go 3 days without getting on Instagram, or I could not post for months, and like it's cool. Yes, there are pressures because it's a way of communicating. Now it's like, you know, why didn't you respond to my DM? But it's like, you have my number. Like we've been friends for 15 years, you know? So I don't want to go on a tangent, but you know, it all connects, and I'm so grateful to have this conversation, you know, to listen to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing in it so much, because yeah, it can be very daunting. It's like, where do you even begin? But that's why I think Jared Lanier's invitation to take at minimum a 6-month break at one point in your life is so, like, it opens up so much possibility. Because when I did take that, my first like 6-month break, I felt things realigning in my brain and in my relationships, and like regaining my attention span. And it was just like a whole it was a whole like metamorphosis, not even to romanticize it, it really did feel like that. But then coming back, I was, you know, stigmatizing myself for use. Like you were saying, when you have a addiction to something or dependence on it, you get defensive. And that defensiveness is a big barrier to transformation, which is, yeah, part of this whole push to step away from shame as we like continue these conversations.
Yes, withdrawal is real. Somebody just commented that.
I love that. Maybe another 1 or 2 comments before we close out. How are we feeling? Who's got something on their chest?
I wanted to say real quick, I appreciate what everyone said, and then also, I'm also thinking about like the importance of just being aware about like the intersections of like social media and like mental health, because I know that like the people who started and like operated these platforms like definitely like fully understand like the psychological effects of like, you know, these algorithms, and they know that. But I think with that self grace like comes like, you know, for me, I've been slowly getting better at like reminding myself of like, you know, to check in like how, you know, like to not be scrolling and engaging in a way that's like, because like sometimes I'd be on Instagram like honestly just kind of like compulsively numbed out, and then like I would have to like take a moment to kind of like snap out of it and like realize like, oh, like this is how this is like affecting like my mental state and like my emotions at, you know. And so I just wanted to speak to that. And then also like for like me having language around some of my symptom manifestations and how they interact with social media has been like super helpful. And like more recently it's like I'm able to, you know, like even recognize when I'm falling into a pattern like where my social media use is like intersecting it with me being like hyper focused on like, you know, a particular account, or just like just being on there for hours and hours. And so even like having that language like helps me to be able to kind of like unravel the pattern of like that I'm stuck in.
Sorry, I was muted. I love that you bring that up. It's the mental health component is so central to all of this. Like within my own divestment journey, I was realizing the ways that Instagram and social media served as a trigger for my mental health, like kind of crises really, and just this feeling of like hyper visibility and like a particular like scrutiny that I think Instagram also engenders that can be really paralyzing, honestly. And it's also interesting because like we want to be vulnerable on these platforms, but they're not built for that. So as much as we like long to share about the kinds of like maybe depression and even mania, I think people talk about depression a lot, but there's less conversation about how Instagram triggers mania for a lot of people who like might suffer from manic depression, and like the kind of less publicly discussed mental health issues that are really amplified by these platforms, be it, you know, posting a lot, or, you know, feeling a hyper inflated sense of self and reach, right? So we talked earlier about how people are judged for their followings, like your legitimacy is correlated to the numbers that you have. But what does that do to your own self-perception, right? Like, how does that inflate or deflate the way that you relate to yourself and trigger a mental health like episode in response to that? So thank you so much for bringing that up. Anyone else before we close out?
I can share a little bit. I think one of the things that's been really challenging for me around my relationship with Instagram is that like I have a really like I have a community that I'm deeply like that I'm geographically removed from, you know, like I grew up in the South and I'm in New York now. And I've changed a lot since like I was home, you know, like I moved up here for school, and I haven't really been back very much since, because it's not really affordable. And one of the things that like was painful that I expected as well, right? Because I've always had an Instagram account, but I've never been the most like present person on it because it always made me feel uncomfortable to be like, just the desirability politics that go into that. I didn't really want to participate in and felt uncomfortable with, but feeling like a memory versus like, you know, like a, you know, somebody that folks have an active relationship with, like the way that a lot of my folks interact and engage with each other is through social media, right? Like it's relevancy, not just in terms of like, you know, oh, who's doing what, right? But in terms of who am I checking in on, right? Like that sort of out of sight, out of mind sort of situation has been really hard for me to navigate personally. And so like, when I'm thinking about like my relationship to social media, I'm also thinking about like, how do I maintain my relationships? And it's especially given the fact that like, it makes it easy, like it just makes it so much like easier. It's like you can post something and then people might like say, it's just like the tiny touch points can be sometimes be enough, right, to like keep certain things alive, especially for me. Like I'm not a texter, like that's overwhelming for me, and like my brain, like I can't do it. I tell people not to text me right, like unless it's like serious or you're trying to do something immediate, right? Like you in a crisis, let's go, I got you. But like on a day-to-day, it for everybody that I have in my, I love but you know, I'm a phone call type of person. So like for me, it feels like a really tricky space because I that is how those folks who I love and care about, right? Like that social media is important to them, right? And social media is an important point of connection for them, right? In ways that like other ways of connecting are not always. And so for me, one of the things that like I'm negotiating is like, what does it mean to be in relationship with folks when like our needs around communication and like, you know, are just like, are different, right? And how do I maintain like real authentic relationships with people that I have so much history and so much love for, right? Like, yeah, that's like the sort of space that I'm in. Cause like everything else that comes with that shit is like weird and evil, but yeah.
Absolutely. I'm looking for a Discord link. There's a data healing Discord server that I'd love to invite y'all to. So I would just sent myself the link and I'll share it with y'all as well. One second. Anyone is welcome to off mute for the time being as well.
I just wanted to say that I need y'all to be pulling up into the lounge, the, you know what I'm saying, QTB BIPOC lounge, you feel me? Because I'll be pulling up and don't nobody be there.
That's real. I didn't even know there were lounges, actually. That's a great plug. Thank you. But yeah, I just shared the Discord link a little bit up. So for folks who do have Discord and would like to stay in communication there, I invite you to do so. We are coming to the close of the session. Thank you so much for your presence and patience, everyone. I felt really flustered at the beginning, if I'm going to be honest, from all of the tech stuff. But just seeing the activity in the chat is really like comforting and affirming. And I'm really grateful to each of you for the participation you brought to the space. This is a conversation that hopefully will be ongoing. And I think, you know, as the point of this session is to begin to speculate around reparations demands for Meta Incorporated. And I have faith that Divest from Instagram can be like a multi-pronged exploration, provocation that we all take on in our own ways. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the ways that it blooms and is tended to in the conversations that will continue from here. So thank you. Please come to our other sessions in the Afro-Presentism track. It'll be lovely to stay in little pods with y'all. And yeah, shukran. I always feel like it's so abrupt when calls end right away. So I'm gonna just play music and people can feel free to leave as they are called to. So let me pull up the